Again, we'll be reading from the book of Mark, chapter 2, verses 27 and 28. That can be found on page 838. And he said to them, "The Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord, even of the Sabbath." The word of the Lord.
Every city has a story, and every storyteller a different form. 5 pastors from 5 cities will share their stories through one verse, revealing that each one of us, from New York to Nashville, to Memphis, to Atlanta, and to Tacoma, have one mission.
I know the series title is One Verse, and I know there were 2 verses read. I'm just going to focus on one of those verses. I don't know what happened in the communication process, but I promise you I am not cheating. I am focusing on one verse, all right? Darren, when he asked me to preach here, I said, man, I'd love to. And then he told me that it could only be one verse. And then he actually told me that what he wanted the topic to be. So he gave me one verse and said, I want you to preach on Sabbath. And I'm like, any other limitations that you have on me, Darren, that you would like for me to know about? But I love being here. It's great to be here. So I have the subject of Sabbath. And the video says every city has a story. And I'll just be honest, the story of my city is one of just sheer exhaustion. New York City was not founded for religious purposes like many of the colonies that were founded along the northeastern seaboard. We were founded for the purpose of making money. That's why New York was founded, and it's always been the reason for its existence. Money, money, money. And so people go there and they work themselves to sheer exhaustion in the pursuit of money. Anytime you ask someone, how are they? There's typically one of 2 responses. One, I'm just so busy. And the other response is, I'm just really tired. I know people who work 80, 90 hours a week. A friend who even at one point worked over 115 hours one week at his job. Our city is just filled with people, like I'm sure your city is, who just need rest. We're tired, we're exhausted, we're depleted, and this becomes sort of the shared experience we all have that becomes a connecting point for community, so that we can all kind of share in this suffering of being exhausted and depleted. We are always running from one thing to the next. When we take a break, we're just thinking about the things that we should be doing that we're not getting done, and we get stressed out and anxious and worried about those things that are being left undone. Our mind's just constantly turning. We live at breakneck speeds. We're always pushing ourselves to the limits, denying ourselves the basic necessity of sleep, and continually propping ourselves up with caffeine. And if I were to do a little poll here this morning, how many of you have at least 3 cups of coffee a day? How about 4? Some of you. All right. Slow drip IV. Are we there yet? Are we there yet, right? Constantly propping ourselves up. As a matter of fact, we actually have these 5-hour energy drinks. We become so poor at managing our time and energy that we have companies who are milking that and making millions of dollars off our need for energy boost. So you drink these little shots that give you 5 hours of energy, and then you crash later. But the point is, we're just constantly needing something to prop us up and help us up because we are exhausted people. We're tired people. We're always working, and everybody's working for the weekend, right? And on the weekend. This is just the culture that we live in now, and it's not the good life. It's not the life that God intends for us. It's not the life that He envisions for us, and it's really not the life that He's provided for us, because God in His grace has provided for us rest. Jesus says that Sabbath is made for you. That God created this day called Sabbath, and He intends that rest and commands that rest be woven into the regular rhythm of your life, so that you are a person who has rest as just the normal pattern for how you live. He calls this rest Sabbath rest. It's in his top 10 commandments. Have you ever thought about this? God says, listen, here's what I want for you, right? Don't worship idols. Don't kill people. Don't commit adultery. Take a nap, all right? So he puts this in his top 10. This is important. You need to weave this into the rhythm of your life. The Sabbath is so incredibly crucial. When God gives his command in Exodus chapter 20, here's what he says to the people. He says, remember the Sabbath day to keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work. You or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant or your livestock or the sojourner who's within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Now notice that the text says that God made that day holy. He consecrated it. He set it apart. He made it different from all other days. God commanded his people to have a day in their week that would be unique. A unique day, unique from all other days. He set it aside as a day for rest. No work was to be done on this Sabbath day. Now, living in New York City, I get great pictures of this because we live in a city where there's a lot of Jewish communities. And there's a lot of Jewish shop owners, even in the neighborhood where I live. So Friday night to Saturday night, sundown to sundown, those that are more Orthodox and Hasidic Jews, they shut their shops down. They close their doors. There's a massive photography store in New York City called B&H Photo. Anyone ever heard of this? Okay, it's owned by Jewish people, and from sundown to sundown, on Friday to Saturday, it's closed down. There's no work to be done. It's to be a place, it's to be a time of rest and a time of worship. And they take that time very seriously. There's a little place called Bagel Works in my neighborhood. Many Saturday morning, I've walked by it and thought, hey, I'll get a cup of coffee. It's closed because it's the Sabbath. And I find myself getting a little bit angry. So it's like not only do I want no rest, I don't want to rest. I don't want anyone else to rest either, right? This is what's happened to us in this culture of exhaustion. We just completely deplete ourselves. But God has said, I want there to be a time frame in your life where no work is done. It's to be a time of rest. It's to be a time of worship. And so it's to be consecrated, set apart for a special purpose. Sabbath time is sanctified time, set apart time, time to be treated differently than any other time. Now the text also says that God blessed the Sabbath day. What does it mean when it says he blessed the Sabbath day? It means that he put his special favor upon that day, and that God loaded that day with blessing so that anyone who would befriend that day experiences their life being blessed and being enriched by it. I was reading something that John Piper wrote about Sabbath, and he pointed out kind of a parallel idea when God says of Abraham, I'll bless you and you'll be a blessing to the nations. Those that bless you, I'll bless. Those that curse you, I will curse. When God blesses something, he loads that thing with a great capacity to bless and enrich the life of anyone who would befriend it. So you befriend Abraham, you receive blessing. You don't, you rob yourself of blessing. And here's the same thing with the Sabbath. This is a special day. It has special blessing of God upon it. And for anyone who will befriend it, it brings blessing and enrichment into your life. Now, the problem in Jesus' day was that the Sabbath was no longer felt to be a blessing. It had now become kind of a burden. The Sabbath was a burden to people. The commandment regarding Sabbath said no work was to be done on the Sabbath, but it didn't fully define work. So the Mishnah, which is a rabbinical commentary on the Hebrew Scriptures, lined out 39 classes of work that profaned the Sabbath. In other words, it kind of teased that command out a little bit to help us understand what it means to keep the Sabbath. And so it said things like this: normal work was prohibited, but also things like tying and loosening knots. You couldn't do that. So if your son came to you and said, Dad, I've accidentally tied my shoe in a knot and I can't get it off, will you help me? You'd have to say to your son, I'm sorry, it's Sabbath. We'll take it off tomorrow. But Dad, my leg is starting to swell. I don't care, son, ice it down, all right? It's the Sabbath. tying, loosening knots. If you were going to sew, you couldn't sew more than one stitch. You couldn't write more than one letter, because if you put two letters together, you were creating a word, and creating activity was prohibited on the Sabbath. No kind of creativity could happen on the Sabbath. If someone's life was in jeopardy, you could help them. But if they just had something mild, like for instance, a dislocated foot or a hand, you couldn't set it until the next day. So you just bite a stick and wait till tomorrow, basically. If a building fell, you could clear debris, but only enough to know if there were any survivors. And if there were survivors, you could pull them out of the debris. But if anyone died, their corpses had to be left there until the following day. So all these rabbinical teachings became very rigid when it came to keeping the Sabbath. The scripture seemed a little vague, so they filled in the missing gaps with all of these regulations. And all those regulations ended up becoming a very heavy load on the backs of the people. And so they made the commandment of Sabbath an instrument of tyranny. And so our passage here says that Jesus and his disciples are walking through a field of grain, and they're hungry, and it's on the Sabbath. And the disciples pick the heads of the grain, and they begin to eat them. Well, the Jewish leaders see this, and they're angry because you're harvesting on the Sabbath, and that violates some of the rabbinical teachings on the Sabbath. And so Jesus speaks to them about this, and he says, look, man is not made for the Sabbath. In other words, it's not as if the Sabbath is a master to which we must submit and report. It's not to be this tyrannical Lord over us that we have to somehow serve. You are not made to serve the Sabbath. The Sabbath was given to serve you. And here Jesus is saying it's not the Sabbath that's the master that we have to submit to. It's not to be a burden. It's to be a blessing to people. The Sabbath is made for man. It's a blessed day, a gift from God. It's not to be so strictly defined that it becomes a burden. So if you don't strictly define it, but you let it be a servant to you the way God intended it to be, the question is, what will Sabbath do in your life? If you were to truly embrace Sabbath, what kind of transformation could it bring about in your life? And I want to help us this morning by just showing us a few things that I think Sabbath will do for us. One, Sabbath will humble and heal us. Sabbath will humble and heal us. So here's what Sabbath tells us. Sabbath tells us that you are not God. Now, I think you know that, but we don't live like that way sometimes. We need to be reminded that we're not God, that we are not invincible, that we indeed are clay, we are decaying, we are destined for death and dirt. This is who we are. We are frail, weak, fragile human beings. And you, because you are a created being who's not invincible, you need rest, and you and I must be renewed physically. We have to have it. And the pace that many of us live is an unsustainable pace for a created finite being. And we test the limits constantly and usually end up crashing and burning out. Mark Buchanan, in his book, The Rest of God, which I highly recommend. If you've not read this book, I encourage you to pick it up. A lot of what I'm sharing this morning was awakened as I read this book. But The Rest of God, here's what he says, and I think the quote may be on your bulletin there. He says, all things not God, all things made by God need rest, and maybe especially us, because unlike goats and beetles and flies and lizards, we try to outwit and outrun our limits. We think we're the exception, the one for whom busyness will translate into fruitfulness. We think because we figured out ways to build impossibly tall buildings and dig immensely deep, broad holes, to spy on babies in the womb, to tease out strands of DNA, to send whole computer files from New York to Nairobi in a split second. We think because our industry and ingenuity seem boundless, we can also figure a way around our God-imposed need for stillness. We can't. The need is not conjured away by medication, technology, discipline, cleverness, sheer willfulness. It always comes back to take its due. We cannot outwit and outrun the God-imposed limits that have been set upon our own humanity, and it is folly to try to do so. It only brings about ruin, weakness, and devastation into our life. We need the Sabbath. It's made for us so that we could experience renewal. We have to humble ourselves and acknowledge that we're not God. We don't sustain all things. God does. And so we need to be sustained and we need to be healed and experience renewal. When you Sabbath, you humble yourself, but you also embrace the healing that day can bring because you cease from what is duty. When you Sabbath, you cease from what is duty. Now, I'm not talking about the duty of things like feeding your children. Right, if your kid comes to you, I'm hungry, Daddy. Hey, kid, fend for yourself. It's Sabbath. I'm taking a break from you, all right? We don't cease from those things. That's not what I'm talking about. We cease from duty, things like your job, your laundry, your grocery shopping, cooking of meals, everything that seems necessary. We engage in what brings delight. Cease from the duty, engage in what brings delight and breathes life into you. This is how we experience renewal in Sabbath. So we rest and we play and we feast. We resist achieving and we just simply enjoy being. We enjoy family and friends and food and drink and recreation, the beauty of a museum, a city stroll, the simple gift of espresso or a nice glass of your favorite beverage. You sleep in. God gives you permission to just take a nap and rest. And I know when we hear these things about ceasing from duty and engaging in what brings us delight, right, and breathes life into us, a part of us gets a little nervous about that. We get a little nervous because we start to wonder, if I'm not working, what's going to happen? If I'm not doing all these things that are my responsibilities and that are my duties, what's going to happen? If I stop from trying to keep all the balls in the air, what's going to happen to all the balls in the air? And we get a little nervous about this. And even when we take a Sabbath day, we don't have a Sabbath heart because we're anxious, we're nervous, we're frustrated, and we haven't learned the art of intentional neglect. People say, I know it's there. I know this responsibility, I know this obligation and this duty, but I'm intentionally, in submission to God and obedience to His word, intentionally neglecting those things. There's unintentional neglect means you don't have control of your life. You don't really know what's going on. You're not really focused on the things that God's put before you. Intentional neglect is a form of obedience to Sabbath. And so if you have a Sabbath day, but you don't have a Sabbath heart, you've not learned the art of intentional neglect here. And the call of Sabbath allows us to acknowledge that God reigns over creation, not us. The way you have a Sabbath heart in your Sabbath day is to allow Sabbath to humble you that you're not God, that He is God, and that you can entrust those things to Him, that God is the source and sustainer of all things, not you, that God is invincible, not you, that God is indispensable, not you, that God is necessary, and you are simply supplemental, that He's infinite, and we are finite and frail. We need to recover. We need to experience healing and renewal. God does not grow weary. God does not grow tired. God does not sleep. God does not slumber, and you are not God, and I am not God. God in His grace has said you need to experience restoration, renewal, healing, rest. And Sabbath is a means of grace to help accomplish that purpose. Sabbath is a call for us to acknowledge God as the present God who rules and reigns over all creation. It's a call to acknowledge that He indeed is the source and sustainer of all things. And when we refuse to Sabbath, it's as if God is asking us, will you not entrust everything to me for just a day? Just a day? Do you not think that I'm strong enough and good enough? Do you not think that I'm sovereign? Do you not think that I rule and reign? Do you not think that I will sustain all things? Can you not trust me to intentionally neglect the duty of your life just to rest and delight in me and the good gifts that I give you? Will you trust me that way? So in Sabbath, we humble ourselves, we cease from the necessary, and we engage in what breathes life into us and heals us. Sabbath humbles us and heals us. But Sabbath also does this. It orients our lives toward God. It orients our lives towards God. It pushes our hearts and minds towards Him. Mark Bittman wrote an article in the New York Times about what is being called a secular Sabbath. A secular Sabbath is an intentional day of disconnecting and unplugging from all things technological so you can rest and think and play and enjoy friendships and engage with your family. And there's a movement in this direction that's helping people power down for a day and recover their humanity. Regain margin in their life that's not being squeezed out by technology, and just enjoy being a person and enjoy other people. In fact, there's an organization in the Northwest called Spark Northwest that puts on clinics to help people break away from their techno addictions. This is called a secular Sabbath. So they put on these little clinics, and when you come in, you have to actually power down your phones. Actually, some people, if they're strong enough, will actually turn their phones in. But they see people actually off in a corner on breaks, turning their phones on and just checking things because we're addicted to it. I mean, you come home, you sit down in your chair after a long day of work. I guarantee for most of you, your phone is within hand's reach, arm's reach, if it's not in your palm, right, already. We have to constantly, some of us wake up at 3 o'clock in the morning and while we're awake, check our Facebook statuses of our friends. Because who knows what's happened between 12 and 3. There's no idea. Someone's status could have changed, and you don't know about it. I have to know these things, right? So we just live in this constant with techno addiction, not the music, the technology. We're just addicted to these things. And so the secular Sabbath movement is saying, hey, let's help you break free from that techno addiction and just recover and let you breathe and let you rediscover what it means just to be human in face-to-face relationships with other people. But the thing about this secular Sabbath is there's no spiritual framework to it. No spiritual framework at all. But the passage in Exodus says this, that this is a Sabbath day unto the Lord. It's a day to the Lord. It's a day that's tenaciously directed Godward. Tenaciously directed Godward. A day where you acknowledge that God is God and has the right to order your day, order your week, and order your life. On Sabbath day, we give our attention to the Lord in a more focused and sustained way than we're able the other 6 days of the week when our attention is so divvied up among other things that are constantly laying claim to our hearts and minds. But on the Sabbath day, this day is different. This day is a focused and intentional day where we recalibrate our hearts and set our minds and hearts upon the Lord. Sabbath is God inviting you to Him. It's an invitation, God, where we give the best of our hearts and the best of our minds to God. We intentionally pause and we just carve out extended time to be with God, to listen to God, to get quiet enough, just quiet enough to experience Him gently pressing upon our thoughts and our perceptions and on our emotions and on our feelings, and really try to create space to meet with God. And we can learn something from the secular Sabbath, folks. We can learn something from this movement. That on your Sabbath, consider powering down, eliminating altogether TV or internet or phone usage, and just embrace quiet. Just embrace quiet. Because Sabbath nurtures stillness. It nurtures stillness, and it actually increases your capacity for hearing and experiencing God. Some of you might say, I don't feel like I really even know when God's speaking to me. I don't really know if I can sense God's voice in my life. I don't really know if I'm experiencing God in a real way. The issue might be your capacity for listening to God and your capacity for experiencing God is shrinking and dwindling. And the reason is because you've not embraced Sabbath, that is a gift from God, a means of grace to increase your capacity to really listen to Him and hear Him. When you give a day devoted toward Godward thinking and Godward feeling and Godward listening, something happens to your capacity over those next 6 days as well. Mark Buchanan, in his book, says this: some knowing is never pursued, it's only received. Some knowing is never pursued, it's only received. And Sabbath is an intentional time of receiving from the Lord and an intentional time of you being focused and receiving from the Lord in such a way that your capacity to receive from Him the other 6 days begins to increase. There are rooms in the heart of God that many of us have never walked into because they're only opened up to us during times of stillness and times of rest, and only opened up to those who've let the Sabbath increase their capacity for really listening and hearing God. Stillness, quietness, rest, these are the times where God reveals Himself most to His people. And Sabbath helps us do that. So don't have a secular Sabbath. Have a Sabbath that is Godward. As you observe Sabbath, pray. Spend time in communication with the Lord. Think about the Lord. Read the scriptures. Read a devotional book. Take a contemplative walk where you just interact with the Lord. Sit in silence and solitude. Make a good part of your day a day set aside for that kind of thinking. And make it different from all other days. Again, you could have a Sabbath day but not have a Sabbath heart because all you did was recreate, but you didn't spiritually recalibrate. And you need both in a Sabbath. There needs to be a portion of the Sabbath that's recreation, where you're just doing the things that really breathe life into you, but also of recalibration and letting the Spirit breathe life into you through the Word and through prayer. And so the Sabbath really orients us towards God. The other thing about the Sabbath is that the Sabbath will orient our lives towards grace. This is very important, towards grace. In Deuteronomy chapter 5, it's interesting because God gives the command of Sabbath again, but he gives a different grounds for it. He gives a different reason for it. In Exodus 20, we saw that he emphasized creation. The Lord created the earth in 6 days, and on the seventh he rested. But in Deuteronomy chapter 5, God grounds the command not in creation, but he grounds it in salvation. He points their attention to the Exodus. He says, you were a slave in Egypt. But yet I delivered you out of your bondage. I rescued you from your slavery in Egypt. And I rescued you, and it was not your work that brought about your deliverance. It was mine. I'm the one that saved you. I'm the one that rescued you. And so in Exodus 14, when we read the account of the children of Israel being rescued out of Egypt, remember, Pharaoh let the people go, and he changed his mind, and Moses and the children of Israel are up against the Red Sea, and the Pharaoh's army is bearing down on them from the back, and the people of Israel think they're going to die right there. And God miraculously parts the Red Sea, and the people walk across on dry land. Now, some scholars who are a little bit more not inclined to believe the Bible say, well, it wasn't the Red Sea, it was the Reed Sea. It's knee-deep water at most, and the children of Israel just walked across knee-deep water. It really wasn't a miracle. But the reality is that that's the case. God drowned the entire Egyptian army in knee-deep water, which is even a greater miracle. Either way, God wins. Either way, right? But as he's rescuing these people, listen to what Moses says to the people. He says, fear not. Armies pressing down on them. They're standing at the edge of the Red Sea. Fear not. Stand firm and see the salvation of the Lord, which he will work for you today. For the Egyptians whom you see today, you shall never see again. The Lord will fight for you, and you have only to be silent. He says to them, God's going to deliver you. He's going to rescue you, but it will be by his work, not yours. He'll fight for you. You just have to sit in silence and stillness and quietness and trust, and he'll rescue you. And so when God commands his people to rest, he commands us to remind the people that it was not by your work, it was not by your effort, it was not by your strength that you were saved from bondage in Egypt, but it was by God's work, God's effort, God's power, God's strength. It was not their doing, it was God's doing. And as you read the rest of the story of God, we see that the Exodus prefigured a greater salvation that God would bring to all people in Jesus. So that Jesus would come and he would save us from the power of sin, and he would save us from the penalty of sin. They would rescue us from sin and death and judgment. That for all who would put their faith and trust in him, Jesus has taken their sins upon himself, died in their place, that they might be reconciled to God the Father, be made sons and daughters of the living God, have his Holy Spirit poured out into their hearts to empower them to live the life that God dreams and intends and envisions us to live, to have life and life at its fullest. But that comes about not by our work, it comes about by Jesus's work. And when we Sabbath, we're speaking the gospel to ourselves. I'm not saved by my works. I'm not declared right with God by my efforts. I'm not rescued out of sin and death and judgment. I'm not freed from guilt and shame and condemnation because of how hard I work for God to even the score and change his countenance towards me. I'm rescued by the work of Jesus, That God treated Jesus like he lived my life so he could treat me like I lived Jesus' life. Jesus was the Son of God who, because of my sin, was treated like an enemy of God. So I, whom an enemy of God because of my sin, I could be treated like a son of God. Jesus gets everything I am and is punished. I get everything he is and I'm received. And it's not my work, it's his work. And when you Sabbath, when you cease from work, you're saying in quietness and trust and faith, I'm depending upon God. And it reminds us of grace, that I'm not saved by my efforts, I'm not saved by my works. It's because of Jesus that I'm made right with God. And it's not just a vertical thing, it's also a horizontal thing. That we're not just working to gain God's acceptance and God's favor often, but we also are consistently working to impress people, to gain the favor of people. We live under the fear of man. One of the reasons it's so hard to Sabbath is because we wrap our identity up so much in what we do or what we accomplish or how we perform and how we're perceived by other people. I got into a discussion the other day with a friend of mine named Peter, who is a banker in New York City, a very successful banker. And as long as I've known Peter, he's gone in very early and he's worked very late. And he's a follower of Jesus. He attends our church. And I began to talk to Peter a couple of weeks ago, and I just said, hey, Peter, I'm starting a men's discipleship group, and I'd love for you to be a part of it. But it's going to be on Wednesday mornings, and I know it's very difficult for you because you go in pretty early. And he goes, and he's South African, so he has this really amazing accent. And anyone who has a British accent or a South African accent, instantly I just perceive their IQ increasing significantly. Like, I wish I had an accent so you people would think I'm smart. But I don't have an accent. But he does, and it makes me think he's brilliant. So he's talking to me, and I said, Peter, I'd love for you to join this, but I know that you probably can't because of your schedule in the morning. He goes, actually, I don't go in near as much as, I don't go in as early as I used to. And I said, really? He goes, yeah, I realized why I was doing it. And it was all about how I was being perceived. It was all about the fear of man. And I just don't really feel enslaved to that anymore. Here's a guy who, for the last several years, has just been sitting under the gospel and is realizing that his identity, his worth, his significance is not wrapped up in what he does or how much he accomplishes or how well he performs or how well others perceive him, but it's wrapped up in Christ and all that Christ is for him and is won for him. And until the gospel erupts in our heart and frees us from our identity achieve mentality, you can live one of two ways: identity achieved or identity received. These are your two ways of living. I will achieve an identity for myself through my own efforts, my own righteousness, my own works, my own accomplishments, my own efforts and successes. And that's bondage, because if you do really well, you feel great, but if you don't, then you end up in shame and you end up loathing yourself and hating yourself for it. Identity achieved or identity received. I receive an identity from God through faith in Jesus Christ, is forgiven, adopted into the family, recipient of the Holy Spirit, a son or daughter of God, a member of his church, a destiny of the new heavens and new earth. That when you have an identity received, it frees you from the slavery of performance. And I think the reason that so many of us are constantly doing is because that's the measure of our being. We derive our meaning from what we accomplish. We live in identity achieved mode. And if I'm doing little work, I'm of little worth. And this is how we feel. So we feel like we're declared right and we're made okay and we have a sense of significance and security. And we're rescued out of our own insignificance by the works of our own hands. So we got to do more, got to be more, got to accomplish more, got to make more money, got to climb the ladder. It's all about my work, my accomplishments. And yet Sabbath is rebellion against that. Sabbath is so subversive in our culture. It just says, no, I will not be defined by the works of my hands. I will be defined by the works of God's hands. I will not be defined by my accomplishments. I will be defined by what Christ has accomplished for me. I will not be a slave to my achievements. I will walk in liberty because of what Christ has achieved for me. And Sabbath is a way for us to rest from working, because our value, our significance, our worth, our meaning, our identity, our joy is not rooted in what we do or accomplish, but in what Christ has done to save us. So regardless of my accomplishments, I'm still a wretched sinner. And regardless of all my failures, I'm still deeply loved. And when I get those two things, I get freed from identity achieved and can just live in the freedom of identity received. And Sabbath becomes a great means of grace to continually preach this over my life. It reorients me to grace because it reminds me I'm not somebody or something because of my work, but because of Christ's work. So rest, and as you rest, remember grace. See, Sabbath ultimately points to the rest that Jesus brings us. Jesus is our Sabbath. He is our rest from working to earn God's acceptance and working to achieve our own identity. He is our rest from that kind of rat race and that kind of slavery, and he brings us freedom. Now, I'm not saying that God isn't calling us to accomplish things for him. I'm not saying that God's not calling us to achieve great things in the kingdom of God or work hard to serve him and manifest and display our love towards him through being involved in the works of his kingdom. That's not what I'm saying. Mike Breen and Steve Cockram wrote a book called Creating a Culture of Discipleship. And in that book, they make a really interesting statement. They talk about how Adam's created on the sixth day, and the seventh day in the creation account is a day of rest. So think about this. Adam is created on the sixth day, and what does he instantly do? He rests. He enters into God's Sabbath rest, and then coming out of that Sabbath rest, he begins to do the works that God gave him to do, to have dominion, to cultivate the ground, right? So Adam begins his existence resting in being God's workmanship, resting in being loved by God, created by God, given purpose and identity from God, resting in that, and out of that rest, he begins his work. And so the rhythm of Scripture is not that you would work to exhaustion and then enter into rest, but that you would rest, and in that rest, resting in being loved by God, resting in being known by God, resting in being received and welcomed by God because of Jesus. Out of that identity, out of that sense of rest in who God is for you in Jesus, then you engage in the things that he's called you. So we're not working for his acceptance, we're working from his acceptance. And we're not working ourselves to exhaustion so that we can rest, but we're just resting in him so that now with that rest, with that energy, with that focus, now we enter into the things that God has for us in our professions and in our families and in our church and in this city. Jesus says, abide in me and you'll bear fruit. So it's the resting, the abiding that brings about fruitfulness in our life. Adam's fruitfulness came from that place of resting in the opening chapters of Genesis. So I'm not saying that God isn't calling us to work hard in the kingdom of God, but to work out of that place of rest. And it all comes down to grace. And so Sabbath orients us to grace. Last thing, and then we'll kind of land this plane. The Sabbath orients us toward hope. Sabbath orients us towards hope. Now, this is when I began to do the study on Sabbath and reading through several writings, and the Mark Buchanan book was helpful in this as well, that when God created the world, it was very good in 6 days, and on the seventh, he rested. And then sin and death entered this world and shattered that shalom. It vandalized that very good. And God got up from his rest, and he began the work of recreation, of new creation, of healing and restoring this broken world. And that work of recreation, of new creation, was accomplished in the sending of his Son. So that Jesus says, the Father is always working, and I'm working with the Father. I'm doing what I see the Father doing. And so Jesus joins the Father in this work of recreation, of renewing and restoring this broken world. And that new creation is accomplished as Jesus dies on the cross to destroy sin. And from the cross, what does Jesus say? It is finished. His work completed. He has brought about redemption. And 3 days later, he rises from the dead, destroying death, and the new creation begins. As Jesus steps out of the tomb in a resurrected body, he shows the world what it's destined to become, free of any kind of sin or sickness or struggle or death, untouched by anything that would seek to bring about harm. And so Jesus in his resurrection brings about this new creation. He ascends into heaven where the scripture says he's seated at the throne, the right hand of the throne of the Father. Why is he seated? Because his work has been accomplished. And he will return one day again to bring about an ultimate Sabbath, to bring about ultimate rest, to bring about the consummation of the new creation, where creation is fully healed, where all sickness and sin and injustice and poverty and suffering and death are all banished in a new heavens and a new earth, and it will once again be very good. So Jesus, through his life and death and resurrection and return, is healing the creation, and he's healing our lives. And Sabbath is a rehearsal of that coming rest. When we Sabbath, we are reminding ourselves there's coming a day where rest will reach us in an ultimate way. In an ultimate way. That's the point of Hebrews 4:9 when it says, there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. There is coming a day when there will be ultimate rest for the people of God. And when we Sabbath in the midst of a broken world, and even with our broken lives, what we're doing is we're rehearsing and reminding ourselves that there is a day coming when God is going to heal all that's wounded, and he will raise up all that's fallen, and he will restore all that's been broken. And as we rest in quietness and trust, we're reminding ourselves of that hope that God will one day heal this world completely. All the exhaustion brought to an end. Jesus depleted for us so that one day everything else could be restored. This is the hope that Sabbath brings us. And it's not just about waiting for a day to come out there, but the reminder is that God wants to bring more and more of that ultimate rest into our current experience as we wait for it in its fullness. He wants to bring renewal even now into our relationships, into our lives. He wants to bring justice to the oppressed, food to the hungry, healing to the hurting. He wants us to be a Sabbath people who not just rest well, but Sabbath people who bring rest to our cities. Sabbath people who live with Sabbath hope to say one day there's coming an ultimate rest, and we want to partner with God to bring a measure of that rest to bear upon our city even now, so that we care for the marginalized and the poor, so that we fight against oppression and cruelty and injustice, that we want to help the sick and the hungry. We want to bring a measure of Sabbath rest to this world even now. As we wait with hope, we also want to be present with help in our city. This is why Jesus performed so many miracles and healings on the Sabbath. By my count in the Gospels, there are 6 healings on the Sabbath. And in this passage, Mark chapter 2 that we read earlier, it's followed by, believe it or not, Mark chapter 3. And in Mark chapter 3, Jesus is in the synagogue on the Sabbath, and there's a man with a withered hand. And the religious leaders are waiting to see if Jesus will heal him. And they're just watching if Jesus is going to heal this man on the Sabbath. And Jesus knows what's going on. You can't really slip anything past him. And he calls the man forward with the withered hand, and he says, stretch out your hand. And the man's hand was healed. And the Jewish leaders were furious, and it says from that day on, they began to see how they could bring an end to him. They began to plot his death. So apparently it's sin. It's a violation of God's law to heal on the Sabbath, but you can plot murder on the Sabbath. That's what's going on in these people's minds. They don't get it. But the reason that Jesus is healing on the Sabbath, he's casting out demons on the Sabbath, he's healing the lame on the Sabbath, he's healing the blind on the Sabbath, is because what Jesus is saying is, listen, there's coming a Sabbath that's going to restore all things. It's going to give the lame legs and give the blind eyes. It's going to give the crippled the ability to leap and dance and shout. Everything that's withered is going to come back to life, Jesus says. There is coming an ultimate rest where everything that's broken and fallen is going to be healed and raised up. And Jesus is saying, I'm just showing you a glimpse of it now. I'm giving you a foretaste of it now. And when you Sabbath, you're rehearsing that hope. You're rehearsing that coming day, and it fuses hope into us because it reminds us of God's story. It reminds us of God's glorious future that he's going to bring about and that he wants to unleash more and more into our present. So to be a Sabbath people says, hey, we want to bring to our city a foretaste of the coming Sabbath that God's going to bring in the new heavens and the new earth. Now, let me close by saying this. It's easy when we hear messages on the Sabbath to say, man, I really need to implement the Sabbath into my life. That's something I bet would benefit my life if I implemented it. But we don't speak that way of any of the other 10 commandments, do we? You know, I'm thinking about implementing marital faithfulness into my life. I think that would be good for me and my spouse. I'm thinking about implementing a no-kill clause into my life because I think that would be good for me. It'd be healthy for me and those that I hate. I think it'd be really good if I did that. We don't speak that way about any command but the Sabbath. We talk about implementing the Sabbath. I don't think implementing is the word. I think repentance. We need to repent, not implement, and we need to obey. We need to say, look, I know this is a gift, but it's not an optional one. It is a command. I don't need to implement it. I need to obey it. God gives it as a gift, but he commands his people to receive this gift and to keep the rhythm of rest deeply woven into their life. This is what he calls us to. So as you try to do that, plan. You have to plan this. What's the best day for your Sabbath? And I would just say this, for 99.5% of Christians in this world, Sunday is the best day for Sabbath. It's the day we remember our Lord's resurrection. It's the day we come together with other believers, brothers and sisters, as a community and say we're a Sabbath people, a time where we can intentionally reorient our minds and hearts towards God in corporate and private worship. Sunday's a great day for that. For you, it might not be the best day, but you need to plan your day. And then you need to prepare. The Jewish community does a great job. They prepare for this. They get meals ready so that on their Sabbath, they're not cooking and cleaning. They're just simply, I guess, nuking. I don't know what. But you prepare your meals beforehand. Or think through your menu. What are we going to have that require little effort and little cleanup so that we don't get distracted with those kinds of things? So plan and prepare. What are you going to do on the Sabbath? Are you going to read a book? Are you going to take a walk? Are you going to go to a museum? Are you going to go to a coffee shop and read for a couple hours? Are you going to play with your kids and go to the park? What are you going to do? Don't always be spontaneous. Actually prepare and then practice it. Because some of you are going to fast or you're going to experience Sabbath with this sermon in mind, and you're going to have all these expectations. Oh man, I'm going to have a Sabbath next week, and I'm just going to experience God, and I'm going to have hope awakened in me, and I'm going to have dreams about the new heavens and new earth, and then you're going to have your Sabbath, and you're going to be cranky and frustrated and stressed out and anxious, because Sabbath is not just a science, it's an art. And listen, I'm not speaking as an expert here. I struggle with Sabbath. I had to sit my staff down last week and repent to them about the fact that I'm losing intentionality in my Sabbath. And it's a science, and here's the science. 1 day out of 6, we got that down, right? That's pretty easy. But the art is different. Science is you have a Sabbath day, but art is you develop a Sabbath heart, and you learn how to glean Sabbath as a means of grace, bringing grace into your life. And so I want to pray for that, for you as a people, and that you would become more and more a Sabbath people for the good of your life, for the glory of God and the joy of your city. Let me pray it for us. God, thank you for the gift of Sabbath. May we embrace it with repentant and humble hearts, and may we do so that you would be exalted as the God of all things, the God who is the source and sustainer of all creation, that you'd be honored and exalted as our great treasure and our great trust, and that our lives would be enriched and that our city would benefit from a Sabbath people. Do this for your glory. We pray it in Jesus' name. Amen.